Hello and welcome to Sensei podcast. This is Manos Brilakis discussing with leaders in the field of CTO and complex PCI. Sensei means teacher or master in Japanese. The goal of the Sensei podcast is to help you learn and improve in CTO and complex PCI so that you can become the best that you can be and offer your patients the best possible results. Hello everyone and welcome to Sensei Podcast. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Colm Hanratty, who is the director of the Cath Lab in the Mater Hospital in Dublin and one of the very early CTO operators who've taught thousands of people literally, both in the UK but also around the world. So Colm, thanks again for joining us today. Very excited to discuss with you.
Yeah, thanks, Manos. Thanks for the invitation to take part in the podcast. Slightly nervous, but looking forward to it.
Well, there's nothing to be nervous about because, again, this is very informal and very relaxed. But for the people who don't know you as well, maybe give us a brief introduction. How did you get into CTO? How did this all evolve into what you're currently doing?
So I was appointed in Belfast in 2003 as a consultant interventional cardiologist. And back then, in 2003, Northern Ireland, the region in which I worked, needed about 1,500 heart operations a year, and the service could only deliver about 1,000. So every year, about 500 patients either didn't get offered cardiac surgery or had to go out of region. And we then just had to deal with complex coronary disease. These cases would now be called surgical turndown. Back then, maybe some surgeons would have operated on them, but anyway, I became good at dealing with multi-vessel complex coronary disease, or certainly had to develop the skill set. And as you know, the most complex part of that is the chronic total occlusion. So I had an interest in that from early days, from my training, from fellowship. Got a job for Simon Walsh around 2008, 2009. And Simon was a fellow, went off to Vancouver, came back and was working in a small district general hospital. And we got a job for Simon in Belfast. And then Simon and I were working very closely doing complex cases, CTO cases. And then over time, we buddied up quite a lot with James Spratt, who was in Edinburgh at the time. James was from Northern Ireland, trained in Manchester and got a job in Edinburgh. And we used to go 2, 3, 4 times a year. We would save up CTO cases that we had failed, and James, Simon and myself got together and we would do these days where we would try to sort, excuse me 1 second, just on the phone, there's Professor Spratt just phoning me as if by, I'll mute that so I will. And we basically got together and did cases and tried to sort of understand it and solve.
Perfect. I'm sure he's going to be offended. You just ignored his phone call, but it's okay.
Yes, exactly.
But I mean, there's clearly a lot of synergies. And actually, both James and Simon have talked about it, and everyone has mentioned how important it was, and still is, that interaction of having other people with the same kind of interests and beliefs to come together and find solutions. So was that what made you get into this in the first place, apart from the clinical need, the kind of community that was supportive and helped you find the ways to take care of them?
I think that's correct. That a lot of people, you probably very like-minded individuals, and James, Sam and I were getting together to do cases. Then along the way you fall in with Julian Strange, and then the group goes from 3 to 4. And in the UK and Ireland, a very strong group of people doing CTO PCI. I think it was about 2011, Bill Lombardi and Tony DiMartini came over and we ran a workshop in Glasgow. And really from there, the sort of community grew, and it became, number one, we recognised there was a need and patients needed to be treated, and that was always the focus, was to get the patients sorted. And it was frustrating that we couldn't do it. We knew there had to be solutions, and then by working collaboratively, with the likes of yourself, Manos, from Early Doors, and if you remember the workshops we had in Chicago, and people just trying to solve it, and a lot of it was medical education too, wasn't it? That the workshops and we call it proctoring, but it's really coaching, isn't it? And it's coaching people to become better, to understand, what are the rules of the game, what are the skills you need. Now go off and practice that. We'll do that in a supportive, collaborative way. We'll regroup and we'll go through the cases and see what we can learn from it.
And then obviously the failures were much more those days, and techniques were still maturing and everything. How did you get through that hump where you do a case and you're all excited, but it doesn't work out, and you spend all these hours, equipment, etc.? How were you able to plow through that and keep on going and finding better ways?
I think in our environment, because we were doing stuff which was slightly off the wall a bit, we were always very careful. And so the registries sprang up very, very early, didn't they? So you could quantify and measure your outcome and measure your success and look at the failures and understand. We were always very mindful, and it's not to say we didn't have complications, but I think we never really went. Yourself, in some cases, there's always a stage where you can back off and not have a major complication. Maybe you're less likely to be successful. So I think we had a good balance between pushing the envelope, but for example, we became good at antegrade dissection entry, so we didn't have to need epicardial collaterals to get retrograde. So there were things we did along the way to try and mitigate and minimize the amount of complications. Because certainly, if you think of it, was very new back then to derail and kill a program. It's complications, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially, I think back then maybe a little easier. I think now, because the expectation is a little higher than it was back then, I think now people are feeling more pressure to deliver and get more complex cases. So the complications happen. And I know actually several programs who failed at an early stage because of that.
Yeah, and I think if we were trying to do this, if you were trying to start this in 2020 versus 2008, if you had our skill set from back then, the equipment, the knowledge, a lot of programs would not get up off the ground at all. So we are in a very different environment. And while we talk about complications, and we know there will be complications, patients don't expect to have complications, and organizations do not expect to have complications. And it's very hard to strike a balance, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, everyone, obviously, the patients have to know that this is a possibility. But I think in your hands, people who have experienced probably have a little more ways to prevent them, but also to handle them if bad things happen. The younger operators might not have the full experience and the repertoire and the flexibility of tackling those cases. So what would you advise them to do at the early stages?
I think the best thing you can do is get a buddy, and you'd Simon Walsh and myself, doing these cases. So you have two experienced consultants. That's a great. Now I realize not every healthcare system will support that, but if you have two consultants doing a case, number one, you're pretty bulletproof from a medical legal perspective. Number two, you've got two good people looking out for each other. And then if you do get a complication, number three, two consultants or two experienced operators solving a complication is more likely to be associated with a good outcome for the patient. Like meanwhile, for example, Julian was in Bristol doing cases by himself with a junior fellow, and that's a much harder path to get the unit to where it needs to be. So that's what I would say. Certainly on the learning curve is case selection, isn't it? You've probably proctored many cases, Manos, and you go to a unit and you get a JCTO score 4 or 5. Now, the case can be done, but it's maybe not a good learning case for a unit. And I think you're probably better starting with lower complexity, understanding the equipment, the strategies, and then build the complexity as the program grows.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, we've all been there. And I think people should actually take the time to do the JCTO. And sometimes even myself, I must say, I get misled. I look at it as I go, it looks good. But then I do the JCTO, it's like 4. I'm like, oops, I missed something. So I think it's always a good exercise to do that. So when you get you started, you don't get the crazy cases early on, exactly as you said.
Yeah, and of course, you go to other centres and these cases have been hanging around. The patients are very symptomatic and there's a CTO expert coming, so we'll put them on for that list. And And of course, we can do the cases, but that's not, the unit aren't going to move along, So it's striking that balance between getting a case which is challenging to bring on their skill set, but not stupid crazy that they're not going to learn anything.
Exactly. And then how do you do your cases now? After more than 2 decades of experience in this, are things different, the way you plan the cases, the way you execute, or you kind of follow now a specific pathway that's mature and is similar from case to case?
Well, as you know, I moved from Belfast to Dublin in 2020, and that was interesting, going from a high volume centre doing 250 CTOs a year to a centre that was doing no CTO PCI, or certainly not any complex CTO PCI. So that was quite interesting. And but you got the knowledge of doing the cases, we got the knowledge of travelling to different healthcare systems, to different centres. So you're starting from a good place, and it then becomes a matter of bringing a team along. Number one, getting a team, educating the team, bringing the whole cath lab along. But to answer your question, in terms of a case, never do a follow-on CTO PCI. Has to be planned. It's done in a planned list, in a planned environment. Obviously, the information in advance, and I try and do bi-radial 7 French where possible, to try and stay out of the leg. But it's just all that planning and just being diligent, and
And then you've taught many fellows as well as people in courses, proctoring in other places. How do you assess the person you're proctoring? Like, can you tell when you walk in a lab, this is going to be a good day or not so good?
I sort of think you can nearly tell by how somebody takes a balloon out of the catheter what sort of day it's going to be. I think I think you become very good, don't you, in terms of observing, and I think there are a lot of tells you can tell, in terms of. It's probably more challenging, I think, for yourself, Manus, where it's very hard to scrub in, and if you're proctoring somebody and you can't scrub, in Europe it's much easier to scrub in, maybe not at the first, but even just showing skills, how to handle a wire, how to handle a microcatheter, those type of things, even just demonstrating that at the table can bring them on quite a lot. Whereas I think a lot of time, unless you've got privileges for a certain hospital, which can be very time and laborious to get, you're not scrubbed. So that can be more challenging, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. For us, it's much more difficult, as you say, because we're just advising without being hands-on. Having said that, that at the same time can be turned into an advantage, because then you have to actually explain everything.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. Rather than saying, let me show you, you have to. And I think as you become good at teaching, I think if you can't scrub, you have to totally understand the procedure. You have to break it down into the parts so that you can explain to the person that you're proctoring what exactly you want them to do, what steps you want them to take, what techniques they need to develop. So I think there are pros and cons from both.
And then how do you actually teach people about that? So how do you, what do you find the most difficult part to teach? Is it the microcatheter? Is it the wiring? Is it the reentry? What part is the most challenging, you think, to get people to understand?
I think we did an Optima last autumn. We did a fellows course the day before, and I think that we have the ability now. Medical education used to be see one, do one, teach one. It's moved on now with the simulators, with the workstations that you can give the information. But to answer your question, I think handling microcatheters, once you get that brings you on quite a lot. Shaping wires and how to wire, the number of operators that use one hand with wiring versus 2 hands. So once you get those basics, it's learning strategy, isn't it, rather than actual skills. So teaching somebody when to use an anchor balloon or a side base, those are just steps. They're not skillful maneuvers. It's just strategy. But you need to be able to handle wires, handle microcatheters, and once you get those skill sets, I think you're well on your way. You know yourself, if you've got the soft bit of a wire into a retroflex septal, and you have to deliver a microcatheter around that on the soft part of the wire, like that's a really tough skill to pick up. You know, it looks very easy, but a lot of times it's not done well.
Yeah, prolapsing, and there you go again. You start from scratch.
Start from scratch.
I think we've all been there several times. How about the personality and the approach? So do you think anyone can learn CTO PCI? Is it for people who have some basic level of skills and both physical skills and dexterity as well as mental skills? How do you see CTO and complex PCI?
Yeah, I think it's hard to select them at the start, isn't it? Like if you think the number of people that have been on the courses you've ran, and you've 30 delegates, and 2 years later, 3 of the 30 are doing CTO PCI. So I think it has been very difficult to discern and to pick up who's going to become a good complex. And I sort of talk about a complex operator, not just a CTO PCI operator, because and it's interesting, the number of people that do ultimately persist with it is lower than we thought. And if you look at the return from all the workshops we've done, it's 10% go on to become good complex operators. So I don't think we've got despite all the, we've thought about it a lot, we've discussed it a lot. And it's probably a combination, isn't it, of one, the ability, the technical ability, two, the mental fortitude. There's not a lot of operators putting their hands up for PCI these days, let alone complex PCI. There's a lot of people that drifting off into doing, for example, advanced imaging that's become very sexy. The structural side of the house is very popular. And why would you want to be doing a 2-3 hour complex post-bypass CTO? So a lot of people are not putting their hands up for this sort of stuff.
So if your son was about to train in intervention, would you advise him to do structural or CTO?
Oh, CTO.
Well, you just said there's a competition.
My son has got skill sets. He can use both hands, so he doesn't need to do structural. You can edit that out. Edit that out. No, the structural.
No, but it is. I mean, you're right.
The Talvi's wire balloon stand these days, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it is. Structural is very popular and it's growing like crazy. Which coronary is more static, and I think the learning curve. Although there also, I think for the complex stuff there too, there's quite a learning curve. But on the coronary side, I think many people may not be willing to go, as you say, for the multi-hour cases and the complications and the stress that comes to that. Which brings us to the question about how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the stress? Or do you get stressed? I mean, you look always very relaxed when I see you do cases. Do you ever get stressed? Or you just got over it?
Yeah, no, I think I don't think I get stressed. And whenever the watches came along, when the smart watches came along, I went through a phase of measuring my heart rate during cases, and I didn't get a spike or change in heart rate during it. But I think a lot of that has come from basically the training. And I said earlier about coaching, and I see a lot of analogies with sport. Like I played sport to a reasonable level, and was always very diligent at practice. And I think we've just practiced so much at this. That you become good and you know your skill set, and I think my big skill is I know my limit. I know when to stop, when to walk away. I think is my main skill. It may result in a slightly lower success rate than some other operators, but my complication rate is definitely much lower. I think the algorithmic aspect that we've brought to this means that you're never really having to think on your feet. So we know step A, step B, step D, and we know what to do throughout the algorithm. So if something isn't working, we move on. So it's never that you're really in a failure mode, that you're stuck wondering what to do. I think we know what to do. I think we know when we've exhausted option A, what's B. If that's not working, when do we switch to C? And I think it's just become coached and trained.
Okay. So, and obviously that took some time. Do you change your algorithms right now, or you think we're pretty mature these days and not much? So
it's interesting. We're constantly evolving, and I run a lot of teaching courses, as do you, and a lot of those are case-based. It's case-based learning. And I look at a case that I did 2-3 years ago, and I say, wow, that was crap. that was really poor, and I wouldn't have done this, and I wouldn't, and how quickly it changes. And part of that's the technologies change, but also the learning. And I look back at a case, like you think of what, even 5 years ago, what percentage of these cases were we imaging on a regular basis? Some people were doing it more for terms of research, but now would you consider doing a CTO PCI without intercoronary imaging? You wouldn't consider it. But if you look at case you did 3, 4, 5 years ago, there's probably cases you had where you don't image. So I think we're constantly evolving little. At this stage, it's maybe small iterations rather than major changes. But certainly a case that I do this year versus last year will be different.
And then how long do you think it takes for people to learn? Everyone wants to know, right? I do a fellowship, I'm going to be good at 1 year. How long do you think it takes to become really good and solid on your CTO complex PCI skills?
It's because, number one, talent is naturally distributed. So some people are more talented than others, so they're starting from a different place. So not everybody's going to be the same. I think before embarking on a CTO chip fellowship, you want to be good at doing two-stent bifurcations. You need to be good at intercoronary imaging, and you need to know how to manage calcium. And by that I mean, when to use shockwave, when to use rotational atherectomy, when to use cutting balloons. And I think if you're coming to a program with those skill sets, you move along very quickly. But if you're spending the first 3-4 months, and we have examples of, when I was in Belfast, of consultants coming over, for fellowships, and you're spending the first 3-4 months teaching them how to use guide cath extension, how to safely intubate arteries, how to do a two-stent bifurcation. So they're going to need much longer to learn. And the reason I talk about complex PCIs, I think those skills are core skills, and then you're just applying them in CTO PCI rather than a specific, there's very few things which are specific to CTO PCI, maybe a stingray. But the rest of the stuff, I did a talk at CTO Summit on CTO PCI skills in the non-CTO case. And the skills are all transferable, use of trapping balloon, use of microcatheter, use of guide cath extension, different types of wire selection. And as I mentioned, with the exception of the re-entry devices, it's the same equipment.
Okay. Yeah, and you say everything builds on itself, and it's not just CTO, it's the whole spectrum of complexity. Now, when it comes to the live cases, and you've done phenomenal live cases for every major meeting, how useful do you see them? So someone who hasn't done a fellowship, are they going to get good at watching on many live cases and learn from that, or is it more once you are a certain level? How do you see live cases as a teaching tool?
I think it's key, and I think it's case-based learning, and if you have to show a case. And the thing about a live case, you're seeing it from start to finish in real time, whereas a case in a box, which is very valuable in terms of education, could be a 4-hour, 7-hour case, which is a complete disaster, truncated into this 15-minute spectacle, which looks very, very good. So, but there's a couple of caveats. I think the live case has to be appropriate for the meeting. There has to be appropriate educational aspects to it. It has to be a case which looks hard, but you and I, as experts, know it's getting done because there are options, and there has to be a very low risk to the patient. So I think that if you get that right, then live cases are incredibly educational and informative. If you get it wrong, then there's less education. So if it's too easy and you wire it in 5 seconds, that's not educational. If you're doing a post-bypass circ with very poor runoff and a single-shot option, that's of limited educational value.
So good selection and obviously keep the patient's safety. Now, when it comes to yourself, you keep very fit and in good shape. How do you do that?
Time management. When I was doing my medical degree and my postgraduate medical education, I was also playing sport to a good level. And if I'm honest, I would love to have been a professional sports person. That's what I would love to have done. So I played Gaelic football. So I was doing 80, 90-hour weeks as a junior doctor, as a trainee, and then training 10, 12 hours as a semi-professional athlete. So I just got good at time management. The training remains important to me. It's a buffer. You train a lot, man. So you get up and you go for a run, and nobody can get at you for that period, and you have to fit it into your schedule. So it means getting up earlier. Training late after day doesn't work. So if I was to go home tonight and go out training, that would be very, very poor. So I got up at 6 this morning, went for a swim, and it's done. And I think it's very important, not just for your physical health, but for your mental health.
So do you exercise every day, or do you do it from?
Yeah, well, certainly I would train currently about 12 hours a week.
Okay, perfect. So keeping, complex PCI and complex training too. That's impressive.
Yeah, it's time management.
Yeah, and then how do you actually do it? How do you fit, all your cases? So something has to give, right? So what gives?
Yeah, I suppose you're selfish to a degree, aren't you? You can't. Now, one of the things about this job, the move to Dublin, is my quality of life is better because I'm working a 4-day a week, versus when I was in the National Health Service in Belfast, I was working a 5-day a week. I was doing on call. Belfast did 1,000 primary angioplasties a year. Sam and I were part of that. Yeah. So that's 3 a day. That's 1 a night, and if you're doing a 1 and 8, 1 and 9, that's very impactful, in terms of your quality. So ironically, I have a lot better quality of life with this move to Dublin. But yes, I have an understanding wife who's a GP and also an athlete, runs marathons. So we were very good at sharing the childcare duties so that the other could get out and train. So that certainly helped.
Perfect. And then, do you have any favorite book or a favorite movie?
Yeah, I was thinking about this movie. I love sort of the fantasy type stuff. So probably favorite movie would be Lord of the Rings. Still, if you're allowed to have all three. So that would be my, if I'm doing a turbo session on a static bike indoor, and put on Netflix and watch Lord of the Rings on repeat. That sort of gets me through my cycles.
Perfect. Well, that's a classic one. I think it's the second after The Godfather. People have mentioned on the podcast.
Yes.
So definitely out there.
I think you're going to take all these answers and analyze them and see if there's some recurring patterns.
There you go. Which movie makes you the best operator, right? So that's right. That's the goal.
That's right.
But then, what are you most proud of? From the things, you are many things, professionally and personally, but what are the things you are most proud of?
Good. Yeah, well, family, very, very, very proud of family. I have a, fantastic family. My son and daughter both play sport at a very high level. So sport's very important to me. The things I'm probably most... I love my work. I love what I do. I love the community that is, and going to CTO Summit, it's great to meet up with people, and it's great to see where it's come along from, 2011. You were probably at the early workshops. I'm probably most, sport. I played football, Gaelic football to a high level, and unfortunately, it was an amateur sport in Ireland. Had it been a different sport in a different country, I may well had an opportunity to play professionally. So that I would have liked to have done. But no, I'm just, quite content with how I've done well at many different things. There's no real standout. I don't dwell on the past. I'm sort of, continue to move forward. So like I'm, still doing triathlons. I'm competing in world championships next month in triathlon. So I just keep pushing on for some reason.
No, that's impressive. And actually, I don't think many people are familiar with Gaelic football. Is that like the American football? Is it dangerous for you? People are colliding at high speeds, or is it a little more safe?
No, well, it's not as physical as American football. If Simon Walsh was answering this question, he'd say Gaelic footballers aren't girls; they don't wear helmets. But it's a cross between rugby, football, and soccer. So it is a full contact sport. And it's played with a round ball, 15 against 15. So it's a bit like basketball in terms of the, one-on-one, or not one-on-one, but that sort of, team-based, spread across the pitch. Certainly more physical than soccer, not as physical as rugby or American football.
Sure. And then how do you get yourself excited? What are the things that you're excited about right now for the future?
In life or work or general?
Anything.
Well, it's a bit depressing over here at the moment with the whole Ukraine-Russian thing and the bank collapse. I listened to a podcast, David McWilliam, the economist, when I travel up and down to Dublin, and it's a bit negative at the moment. No, I live for the day. I enjoy, I have a very good work-life balance. I enjoy training. I enjoy competing in triathlon. I enjoy keeping fit. My targets are not work, if that makes any sense. I'm not counting the number of cases I do. I'm not counting, how often I'm in the cath lab. I'm not, I've maybe even stepped back a bit from, meetings before we went live. So like going to CTO Summit, that's given up 4 or 5 days to go for a 2-day meeting. Now it's well worth it for that particular meeting, but is it worth it for a meeting in somewhere in Central Europe for 2 days? I've decided maybe not. So I'm saying no to a lot more meetings unless I feel that I'm really contributing something to it or I need to go to it. And the reason for that is that's giving up 2-3 days of training, or and I'd much rather. So, for example, James Spratt, Julian, Mike Wyman, and I are going cycling in May in Scotland. So that's a week's annual leave that, and we're going to hook up and go and spend 5 days cycling. And I'm at a stage where I'd much prefer to do that than maybe go to a PCR. Because you can't do both.
Should we cut it out? So we cut it out from the. I'm not kidding. I'm kidding. But you're right. I mean, priorities change, and it's a sense of maturity. I mean, in the beginning you say yes to everything, right? And then eventually you are much more selective because you're aware of the limitations and the things that you take away.
I think so, and I think that when you say what had to give, the thing that gave is family life, isn't it? That 5-6 years ago, whenever you're in China 4 times a year, you're in South Africa, you're in the States a couple of times a year, and you're traveling around Europe. You're not about as much, and COVID, I suppose, was a bit of a reality check for a lot of us that you couldn't do these things. So you spent more time at home, and my kids were teenager, and if your kid's 6 and you miss a football match, it's not that important. But if your kid's 17 and they're playing in the semi-final of a school's cup, you can't miss that, and nor do you want to miss it. So I think I've just decided that I've done a lot. I certainly got much further on in this game than I ever thought I would or thought I ever could. I don't think I've anything to prove, certainly to myself. And so I'm at a stage where if I, like the people at a meeting and I want to go to a meeting. So, for example, MLCTO, great meeting, great guys. I'll definitely go to that meeting. But maybe some other meeting, I'll decide, no, I don't have or maybe I'm not prepared to sacrifice the time to go to it.
Sure. Well, Colm, again, thank you so much. That was incredible insights, both on how to learn this, but also how to find the balance, which I think is not common sense, and many people have a hard time finding the balance between those two. So thank you so much for taking the time. Super excited to keep on working with you and learning from you.
Thanks for the time. Take care now.
Thank you for listening to the Sensei podcast.